I want to tell you about the moment I stopped trusting the timeline. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't a single photograph or a shocking document. It was quieter than that. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was looking at an architectural survey of a mid-18th century European structure, a building the official record describes as a customs depot, and I noticed something. The ceiling clearance was 40 feet. 40 feet. In a customs depot, built supposedly for horse-drawn carts and men with ledger books. I sat with that for a while. Then I started looking at the adjacent structures in the same survey. Long parallel berths, covered walkways, massive mooring points along the exterior walls, rendered in the architectural drawings as hitching posts. Hitching posts for horses, except they weren't at ground level. They were at roof height, 3 stories up, facing outward, into open sky. I closed the survey. I opened another, and another. The deeper I looked, the more the word customs depot began to feel like a translation of something else, a deliberate translation, a careful one. And that's where this investigation begins, not with planes, not with the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk in 1903, not with the official certificates and newspaper clippings and grainy black and white footage we've all been shown since childhood. No. This begins much earlier, with structures that shouldn't exist, with infrastructure too deliberate, too coordinated, too expensive to have been built for the purposes we've been assigned. This is the story of the airports that existed before airports were supposed to exist. Stay with me. Let me ask you something that sounds obvious. What is an airport? Strip away the jet bridges and the duty-free shops and the departure boards. Strip away everything modern. What remains? At its core, an airport is a collection of very specific features. You need a large, flat, open approach, unobstructed and carefully graded. You need structures capable of sheltering enormous vehicles from weather. You need mast or anchor points for mooring. You need fuel and supply infrastructure. You need passenger processing, arrival, departure, waiting, transfer. You need administrative oversight. And you need it all to coordinate, to communicate with other nodes in a network. That's an airport. That's what the function demands. Now, with that definition in mind, that purely functional technology agnostic definition, I want you to look at a different category of structures entirely. Structures we've been taught to understand as something else. Warehouses, agricultural stations, military depots, exhibition grounds, rail marshalling yards. Because here's what I found, again and again, across multiple continents, across multiple decades of the 18th and 19th centuries, there exist complexes of architecture that fit the functional profile of an aerial transit hub almost perfectly. Not partially, not vaguely, precisely, with a precision that becomes impossible to dismiss once you start tabulating it. Let me describe what a mid-18th century transit hub looks like, according to the official historical record. It doesn't exist. That's the answer. That's the entire answer. There were no transit hubs. There were coaching inns, port docks, river landings, modest, functional, scaled to human bodies and animal labour. That's what 1750 looks like, according to the textbooks. Now let me describe what I actually found. In Western Europe, there are dozens of large-scale enclosed structures dating to the early and mid-1700s that share a peculiar set of architectural features. Features that have no satisfying explanation under the official timeline. Long unobstructed interior spans of 50 to 100 feet, vaulted ceilings, external anchor points at elevation, wide flat approach corridors, sometimes paved, sometimes cleared of all natural obstruction for extraordinary distances, drainage systems of enormous sophistication, channeling water away from what can only be described as loading surfaces. Loading surfaces. not warehouses. The proportions are wrong for warehouses. In a warehouse, you optimize for stackable vertical storage. You want walls close together, shelving, vertical height. What these structures optimize for is horizontal clearance, ceiling height, and lateral access. That is not a warehouse, that is a hangar. And here's the strangest part. Many of these structures appear in regional maps and surveys of the period under remarkably vague designations. Grand Depot, Civic Pavilion, Municipal Hall of Commerce. Descriptions so generic they communicate almost nothing for a period of history that was otherwise extraordinarily specific in its record-keeping, property records, tax assessments, land surveys of remarkable precision. These particular structures are documented in the haziest possible terms. The official explanation collapses here. It simply does. You cannot account for the dimensions, the layout, and the absence of detailed records with Civic Pavilion. That explanation breaks the moment you stand in front of one of these buildings and count the anchor rings. I need to talk about the photographs. I know what you're thinking. The 1700s predate photography. Daguerreotypes don't appear until the 1830s. And practical photographic technology as we understand it doesn't arrive until the mid-19th century. This is true. This is part of the official record, and I'm not here to dispute the chemistry. But there is a category of early photographic image, daguerreotypes, calotypes, album and prints from the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. That shows something that the people taking those photographs apparently didn't think was worth remarking upon. Something so ordinary to them that they simply included it in the frame. In the background, on the horizon, half obscured by architectural detail, large elongated aerial forms, not birds, not clouds, elongated cigar-shaped or rounded structures, sometimes with what appear to be gondola attachments beneath, sometimes moored, sometimes, in the most arresting examples, appearing to approach or depart from exactly the kind of large clearance structures we've been discussing. Now, the official history of lighter-than-air travel has a very clean narrative. Hydrogen balloon flight, the Montgolfier brothers, 1783. Steerable airships, dirigibles, not until the 1850s at the very earliest. And practically not until the 1880s and 1890s. Zeppelin technology, early 20th century. The timeline is presented as a clean, progressive development, but this raises a simple but critical question. Why do photographs from the 1840s, decades before steerable airships supposedly existed, occasionally show what appear to be more dirigibles against urban skylines? And why, when these images are raised, does the response from the academic and archival community tend to be not investigation, but dismissal? Photographic artifacts, cloud formations, processing errors, not elongated cigar-shaped structures with visible gondolas, not objects moored at rooftop height, not things hovering in fixed positions relative to large civic structures. No. Cloud formations. The silence was deafening. Here is where the mystery deepens in a way I find almost impossible to rationalize away. The architectural features I've been describing, the long approach corridors, the elevated anchor points, the vast interior clearances, the suspiciously vague documentation, they are not confined to Western Europe. They repeat. They repeat across continents, across cultures, across what we are told were completely unconnected civilizations, with what I can only describe as unsettling precision. In North America, there are structures from the mid to late colonial period, structures predating the Revolutionary War, that share these proportions. Grand civic buildings in early American cities with ceiling clearances that far exceed any functional need described in the historical record. Some of these structures were later repurposed, converted to train stations when the railroad era arrived, then converted again, in some cases, to aviation terminals in the early 20th century. 3 separate transit modalities, 3 separate first uses, all in the same building. Why does a building designed in 1740 happen to be perfectly suited for a technology that supposedly wasn't invented for another 160 years? And then, when that technology is superseded, happen to be suited for the technology that came after that? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In South America, colonial-era administrative complexes with the same vaulted approach halls, the same overbuilt flooring, capable of bearing loads far in excess of anything a warehouse or government building would require. The same anchor points, the same mysterious drainage. In regions where the Spanish colonial record is otherwise extraordinarily detailed, about every nail, every beam, every shipment of tile, these specific structures appear in the record as administrative complex and nothing more. In parts of Central Asia and the Russian steppe, structures associated with what some researchers have tentatively called the remnants of a prior administrative civilization. And here the word Tartaria enters the conversation, not as a defined empire, not as a mapped nation-state, but as a descriptor for something that existed before the current historical consensus, something that has been systematically reduced to cartographic margin notes and dismissive footnotes. These structures share the same vocabulary. Long horizontal spans, elevated mooring infrastructure, wide approach clearances, remarkable unnecessary precision. And here's the strangest part. The dates don't cooperate. Some of these structures are dated to periods when, according to the official record, the regions they occupy were either uninhabited, pre-industrial, or incapable of the engineering they represent. The dating itself is in many cases contested, not openly contested, not in journals or symposia, but quietly contested in the marginal notes of regional surveys, in the footnotes of architectural histories that most people never read. The evidence suggests something much larger than regional anomaly, something coordinated, something worldwide. And coordination in 1720 or 1740 or 1760 was supposedly impossible. The communications technology didn't exist. The engineering knowledge wasn't shared. The civilizations in question were, according to the textbook, isolated from one another. So how do you build the same building on 4 continents? Now, I want to be precise here because precision matters. I'm not describing a known empire. I'm not placing borders on a map. The word Tartaria appears in European cartography from the medieval period through the 18th century as a designation for vast, imperfectly understood territories, Central and Eastern Asia, stretching in some maps to include everything east of Moscow and north of China. It is a word that functions in those maps as an admission of ignorance. Here is a place we don't fully understand, but ignorance is not the same as emptiness. What interests me is not Tartaria as a political entity. What interests me is the possibility, and I'm asking this as a question, not making a claim. The possibility that those territories designated as Tartaria on 17th and 18th century European maps contained the remnants of a sophisticated civilization. One that had developed or inherited aerial transit technology. One that had built infrastructure to support that technology. And one that, for reasons we cannot fully reconstruct, ceased to exist in recognizable form before the modern historical record solidified. Before the records were written that we now treat as primary sources, and that's where the architecture becomes impossible to ignore. Because when European explorers and administrators moved through Central Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the great surveying expeditions pushed into the territories that had been labelled Tartaria, they found things. Large, ruined structures, buildings of unusual precision, foundations that seemed to predate the civilizations currently occupying the land. And in the official records of those expeditions, those findings are documented and then set aside, classified as ruins of unknown origin, attributed to various ancient peoples in ways that satisfy no one who looks closely at the engineering. Unknown origin, that phrase does a lot of work in a lot of documents. The deeper I went into expedition records from Central Asia, from the Russian interior, from the territories that appear on those old maps as Tartaria, the more that phrase appeared. Unknown origin, unknown function, unknown date. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern of deliberate vagueness, the consistent refusal to integrate anomalous evidence into the official narrative, the repeated application of vague language to specific things. Here is the thing that keeps me returning to this question. The technology vanishes, not slowly, not gradually. It doesn't fade the way technologies typically fade, leaving traces, leaving transitional forms, leaving the archaeology of replacement. It vanishes with a completeness that is itself anomalous. If airship or dirigible-based transit infrastructure existed in the early 18th century, and I'm saying if, and I'm asking you to hold that if with me, what would we expect to find in the historical record? We would expect transitional documents, engineering notes, the kind of accumulated iterative knowledge that every technology leaves behind. We would expect regional variations, the same basic concept adapted for different climates, different materials, different cultural contexts. We would expect failures, accidents, legal records of liability and loss, insurance documents, the bureaucratic residue of a technology in active use. What we find instead is silence, and when that silence ends, in the mid-19th century, what emerges is something described as entirely new. The balloon, the airship, the dirigible, all presented as inventions, as the origination of concepts that had never previously existed. But what if they weren't inventions? What if they were recoveries? What if the engineers and scientists of the 19th century who invented lighter-than-air flight were not originating ideas but rediscovering them, working from fragments, from architectural evidence, from the kind of structures I've been describing, those overbuilt, vaguely documented, strangely proportioned buildings that were still standing in European and American cities, still waiting, still bearing their anchor rings and their impossible ceiling clearances? This raises a simple but critical question. How do you reinvent something that never fully disappeared from the landscape? How do you originate a concept when the infrastructure for that concept is still physically present in the cities you inhabit? The official explanation collapses here. It simply does. I want to talk about what happens to these structures over time. The pattern, once you see it, is consistent enough to constitute its own argument. Stage 1. The structure exists. It is large, precise, overbuilt for any stated purpose. It appears in surveys and maps under generic designations. It functions in some capacity that the official record does not clearly specify. Stage 2. A new transit technology arrives, rail, then early automotive, then aviation, and the structure is repurposed, not demolished, not rebuilt, repurposed, minor alterations, different signage, new function, old bones, the original architecture, those long clearances, those anchor points, those approach corridors, remains largely intact because it happens to be perfectly suited for the new use as well. Stage 3. The history of the structure is rewritten backward. The repurposed building is described as having been built for its new function, or its original function is described in terms compatible with current technology. Obviously, this was a precursor to the train station it eventually became. The wide corridors were designed for the volume of civic commerce. The original anomaly is absorbed into a new narrative. Stage 4. The original documentation, whatever specific records might have described the structure's true first function, is either lost, classified, or never consulted again. The archive closes around the comfortable explanation, like water around a stone. This is not conspiracy in the traditional sense. I'm not describing a room full of people deciding to lie. I'm describing something quieter and more pervasive. The tendency of institutions to prefer coherent narratives over anomalous evidence. The tendency of official history to sand down the edges of things that don't fit. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across continents, across centuries, in document collections from institutions that have never spoken to one another. The same vagueness, the same overbuilding, the same convenient subsequent repurposing, the same closing of archives. Not coordination, exactly, but something that produces the same result as coordination. And that is, perhaps, the most unsettling possibility of all. Let me return to the photographs. There is a category of early photographic image, and I've spent considerable time in digitized archives tracing these, where the object in the background, the anomalous aerial form, appears in images associated with known large clearance structures. Images taken from vantage points that suggest the photographer was documenting the building, not the sky. And yet there, in the sky, or above the roofline, or against the distant horizon, there is the form, elongated, deliberate, too consistent in a shape across different images, different photographers, different cities, and decades to be a processing artifact. There are images from the 1850s and 1860s, the very early days of urban photography in Europe and North America, where these forms appear above structures that were, within decades, formally redesignated as transit hubs when rail technology arrived. The same buildings, the same skylines, the aerial form present in the earlier image, absent in later ones as the 20th century approached, and the technology of the images became more reliable, the archives more carefully curated. Why would an image processing artifact appear consistently above a specific category of building? Why would cloud formations cluster over structures with anchor rings at rooftop height? Why would the anomalies, whatever they are, appear in early photographs and then systematically disappear from the record as photographic technology improved and archival practices became more rigorous? The evidence suggests something much larger than coincidence. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm showing you what I found. I'm asking the questions that I found impossible to stop asking once I started. Here is the question I keep returning to. If any part of this is true, if those structures were built for aerial transit, if the technology existed earlier than we're told, if the photographs capture something real, then who built it? And I want to sit with that question rather than answer it. Because the moment you answer it, the moment you name a civilization or a group or a power, you move from mystery into mythology. And I'm not interested in mythology, I'm interested in evidence. What I can say is this: the structures exist. They are physically present, many of them still standing, still bearing their anomalous features, still documented in surveys that you can access if you know where to look. The early photographs exist. The vague designations in the official record exist. The pattern of repurposing exists. Something built those structures. Something used them. Something, and this is the word I keep coming back to, something was lost. Not misplaced, not forgotten in the way that small things are forgotten. Lost in the way that requires active losing. The kind of loss that leaves behind only the physical evidence, stripped of its context, relabeled, absorbed into a different story. The kind of loss that looks from a distance like it might have been intentional. I started this investigation with a ceiling height, 40 feet in a customs depot. I end it with a simpler question. What was in the sky, not what we're told was in the sky? Not the official inventory of 18th century aerial objects, which is, by definition, almost empty. But what was actually there? What were those anchor rings waiting for? What were those approach corridors leading to? What did the people who built those structures, the people who commissioned them, funded them, maintained them, operated them, what did they see when they looked up? Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The long clearances, the anchor points, the vague documentation, the photographs with their inexplicable backgrounds, the structures that keep getting repurposed perfectly for every new transit technology that arrives, the archives that close, the records that thin, the word unknown appearing again and again in documents from expedition to expedition, continent to continent, century to century, unknown origin, unknown function, unknown date. The silence was deafening, and the sky was full of something. The deeper you go, the more the official explanation breaks down. Not here, not there, but everywhere. All at once across 4 continents and 3 centuries of vague documentation and overbuilt architecture and photographs that don't belong to their own era. This raises a simple but critical question. What do we actually know about the sky above 1740, about 1720, about 1690? And perhaps more importantly, what have we agreed collectively and quietly not to ask? The buildings are still there, the anchor rings are still there, the sky is still open, and somewhere between what we've been told and what the evidence shows, there is a gap large enough to fit an entire lost world of transit, an entire civilization of departure and arrival, of mooring and casting off, of whatever it was that rose into that pre-modern sky and crossed the distances we were told couldn't be crossed until someone built an airport to receive it.